one God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. A few years ago, I met a young acolyte. He was about 13 at the time, and he had been acolyting for several years, but it was my first time serving on the altar with this particular acolyte, and he caught my attention right away, as he did almost everybody else who was on the altar team, because there was something about that child. You could see it in his face. It was as if he was lit from within, and there was a glow coming out of him, and all of us on the altar were looking at him going, something holy is happening over there with that child. Jesus is over there with that child. And afterwards, I talked with him about it. He talked about how much he loved being on the altar. He had looked forward to it growing up. When he was finally 10 years old and got to do it, he was so excited to do it. And he looked forward to doing it every Sunday that he got to do it. And I said, so how often do you serve on the altar? And then a sad thing happened, because he started telling me about his life and all of the responsibilities that he had in terms of homework and after-school activities. And the whole time he was talking, his shoulders started creeping up like this, and his neck started to jut out, and he was getting more and more tense and anxious, telling me about how many papers he needed to write, what his responsibilities were on his soccer team, what he was trying to accomplish, and all of these things he was trying to accomplish in his after-school activities were to make sure that he got into the right college, a good college, one that would give him a good start in life. All good things, nothing wrong with this at all. By the end of the conversation, two things were happening. I was stressed out listening to him. I was so tired hearing about his life. All I could think is, thank heavens it's not me, because I am worn out listening to everything that this 13-year-old had to go accomplish. The other thing that happened is he started getting those red blotches on his neck and on his cheeks that happen when people start getting really nervous and really anxious. And when I walked away from that child, the thing that was so striking to me, sometimes I feel like I really can see the gospel story on other people, I thought, this is what it looks like when someone's light is put under a basket. This is what it looks like when someone just blows out that light that comes with whatever expectations they have otherwise, whether they are good or bad or in between. It was as if somebody came along and took the light right out of this child. By the time he finished telling me the story and left, that thing that we all saw on the altar when he served was gone. And to make the story even more sad, within 3 months, he was no longer in that church. Now, he's gone on to college, and I'm sure in all that he does, there probably isn't much time for his spiritual life. The good thing for us that we can count on is that God knows exactly where he is. And God will find him at another point in his life. That connection will be remade again. But it was a perfect illustration of this story, of what Christ is talking about. Without that salt that makes us flavored by God, without that light that comes from God, that illuminates us by God, without that, we become these other people. It was rough to look at it on a 13-year-old child. It was striking to see it on him because the physical manifestations were so apparent. Adults do the exact same thing, though. I don't necessarily see the shoulders creep up and the blotches come out on their face, but the same kind of thing happens to us. And that's what Jesus was talking about with those disciples. How is it that they were to follow Christ? How are we to follow Christ? At that time, when they were following Christ, they were desperately trying to follow all the laws written in the Torah. All 600 plus laws that there were that guided how you were to eat, how were you to prepare your food, where were you to live, when you were to work, how were you to pray, when you were to wash, what kind of cutlery you could use with your food. I mean, all kinds of details. They were working hard to follow all of that in order to be ready to do whatever Jesus needed them to do. And then after Jesus died and was resurrected, they were still trying to do the same thing so that they would be ready when Jesus came back in the early church. They were doing the same thing that the disciples were doing with Jesus. And guess what? We're doing the same thing that those disciples that Christ talked to, and that those folks that Paul then talked to in Corinthians, and here we are today doing the exact same thing. No, we're not trying to follow those 600 rules from Torah, but we certainly are trying to follow the limitless rules of modern American culture. Whatever this culture tells us we must do, we jump to it. As fast as we can, as intensely as we can, and as consistently as we can. We're so busy trying to hit that success mark the way modern culture has told us success is supposed to look. But not only does it wreak havoc on our own lives, it's doing it to our children. We're raising generations now of people who think that that kind of strive, even though I feel bad, even though I don't like what I'm doing or myself, even though the thing that brings me great joy I don't have time for, I still need to get it done because it'll get me into a good college, which will get me into a good career, which will get me into that life that everybody says is the kind of life I'm supposed to have. Somewhere along the line, somebody told us we must be homeowners. We must have a home equity line of credit. We must have a car with all-wheel drive, and actually we must have two. We must have vacation once a year, twice a year, 3 times a year. Think about a vacation home and think about a timeshare. We must have the right clothes. We have certainly got to have a PC at home, and hopefully also a laptop. And by the way, a cell phone is not good enough. You must have a smartphone. And where is your iPad? We have bought into it and taken our kids right along with us, who are walking around with their shoulders up by their ears, nervous as they can possibly be, trying to figure out, how do I succeed? How do I make this happen? How is it that I am going to be the right person, the good person, the person that I'm intended to be? And you know, if it were working, I would stand back and applaud, and I'd think, look at all these happy people that God has filled the world with. But think about what goes around in your own house, in your own family, with your own circle of friends. How many people do you know that you look at and you think, wow, there is the light of Christ in them. Boy, when I am around them, I know that God is there. It's a rarity. It's something we don't see very often. We really have to stop and think about it and search our way through all the people we know. We eventually come up with them. But they are not the dominant force in our culture right now. That hard-driving consumerism that has veiled itself as success is the dominant force in our culture right now. And it affects us because we get so caught up in it that it's as if we lost our flavor. When I first started baking, and I've loved to bake most of my life, but when I first started baking, my very first cake on my own, no parental help, was a pound cake. And in the part of the country where I grew up, and 2 things define who you are as a cook: your fried chicken and your pound cake. You better be good at those 2 things. And I was determined I was going to have an excellent pound cake, and I wanted it to be different than my mother's and my grandmother's. So I worked on that sucker. I creamed my butter. I was careful about the sugar going in. My eggs were at room temperature. They went in one at a time. I didn't rush it. The butter stayed that nice yellow color that it's supposed to stay. It went in the oven. I didn't touch the oven. I was desperate to go take a look. I didn't touch the oven until it was past the time. I did the one little cake test with a cake tester. Not with a knife, not with something that would have ruined the look of the cake, but with a thin little cake tester. It came out with not a crumb. I took it out. Everybody looked at it and said, "That is a beautiful pound cake. Congratulations." And then we cut it and had a bite. And it was a nice sweet vanilla thing. Felt like a pound cake, looked like a pound cake, didn't taste like a pound cake because there was no salt in that pound cake. One little teaspoon of salt changed it from something wonderful into something that had to get thrown away. I mean, what could you do with it? It was just sort of a sweet vanilla thing. It felt like something in your mouth, but it didn't taste like anything. That's who we become. It's not that we're bad people. It's not that we're people that are doing anything that is wrong or evil in the world. It's just that we're not the people that God means for us to be. That beautiful creature that we're created to be. We're missing that element that comes from God. When we latch on to the culture like that, we push out that element that comes from God. And we start behaving like members of the culture. We get so caught up in that striving. We get so caught up in that goal that the culture has set for us that we forget about the goal that Christ set for us. We forget about being a disciple. One who follows Jesus. It really is that simple. How do we do this? How do we do life? How do we do modern American culture? Being like those who follow Jesus. I think